In a world defined by quiet deals and louder denials, one decision sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. A plan, controversial, secretive, and cloaked in humanitarian language, was quietly set in motion to redirect thousands of unwanted migrants towards the African continent. But in the heart of the Sahel, a voice refused to bow. Burkina Faso's young leader, Captain Ibrahim Traore, stood before the cameras and the world, declaring that Africa would no longer be a dumping ground for anyone's discarded humanity. What followed was not merely a policy dispute, it was a moment of continental awakening. The story begins in the uneasy years after global migration crises had reshaped international politics. Western nations, facing internal pressures, sought new ways to manage asylum seekers and undocumented migrants. Some proposed bilateral processing arrangements, outsourcing the humanitarian burden to countries far from their own borders. For Africa, such deals promised funding, infrastructure, and diplomatic favors. But beneath the diplomatic phrasing lay an unsettling message: our surplus humanity will become your responsibility. When whispers emerged of a potential arrangement involving U.S. intermediaries and a handful of African governments, the announcement seemed unremarkable to the global public. After all, similar plans had been tried elsewhere. Detention centers outsourced, refugee camps funded abroad, human lives converted into bargaining chips of international relations. Yet within Africa, the implications were enormous. To accept such an arrangement meant accepting a symbolic role: custodian of others' unwanted souls, jailer of the world's poor. Burkina Faso, under Captain Traore's transitional government, was not the obvious place for resistance. The nation was fighting insurgencies, rebuilding institutions, and navigating sanctions. Yet the decision to reject what officials privately described as a human dumping framework was more than bureaucratic. It was existential. In that rejection, Africa heard an echo of its own defiance. Centuries in the making, diplomatic cables leaked in following weeks hinted that the proposed initiative involved relocating groups of detained migrants from third countries into African processing zones. Advocates framed it as cooperation. Critics called it commodification. Traore's administration issued a terse statement: Burkina Faso will never accept the transfer of foreign detainees or migrants as part of any external arrangement that compromises our sovereignty or human dignity. The phrasing was deliberate, calm, firm, legally precise. Yet its meaning resonated far beyond Ouagadougou. Across African capitals, analysts recognized a precedent being broken. For decades, external powers had relied on the continent's economic fragility to negotiate asymmetrical deals in resources, in security, and now in people. By saying no, Traore's government confronted not a single plan, but an entire system of dependency. International reactions were mixed. In Washington and European chancelleries, diplomats downplayed the episode as a misunderstanding. Privately, however, policy advisors worried that Burkina Faso's stance could embolden other African nations to resist similar arrangements. To them, this was not about one country's moral stand. It was about a narrative escaping control. For ordinary Africans, especially the youth watching through social media, the speech carried a different symbolism. It was proof that a small state could speak the language of equality in a room full of giants. Memes, hashtags, and street discussions turned Traore's declaration into a continental moment. In cities from Dakar to Nairobi, students debated what true independence should mean in the 21st century. Not only political freedom, but moral sovereignty. To understand why this episode resonated so deeply, one must return to Africa's post-colonial economic architecture. For decades, external assistance and conditional aid had blurred the lines between partnership and control. Under the rhetoric of development, many African nations had accepted policies written elsewhere, believing compliance ensured progress. But the cost was subtle, an erosion of the right to say no. When Burkina Faso refused the so-called human dumping proposal, it invoked that right. For the first time in years, an African government was publicly articulating the principle that not every offer wrapped in aid was a partnership. Some were traps of moral dependency. The reaction across the continent revealed how hungry Africans were for such clarity. In a time when global narratives often painted Africa as passive terrain, recipient of charity, victim of circumstance, this act reasserted agency. As analysts examined the fallout, they noted that Burkina Faso risked financial retaliation. Several aid programs were already under review. Trade discussions cooled. But Traore's government, drawing strength from regional alliances within the Sahel, seemed prepared. His administration argued that sovereignty could not be auctioned. In interviews, officials framed the issue not as anti-Western hostility, but as a test of equality. If partnerships are genuine, they must be voluntary. If they require submission, they are not partnerships. This narrative cut deeper than many expected. In think tank circles, from Washington to Brussels, the term African assertiveness began to appear in policy briefs. Commentators debated whether the continent was entering a new era of self-definition, where aid and influence would be measured not by generosity, but by respect. Even those skeptical of Traore's governance style admitted that his rhetoric had struck a global chord. Meanwhile, in African media, discussions widened to include the moral geography of migration. Why should continents responsible for the majority of global emissions, conflicts, and economic disruptions externalize their human consequences to regions already struggling? Why should Africa, the youngest and least responsible continent, become the receptacle of others' crises? The rejection of the dumping plan became a mirror for deeper discontent. By mid-year, Burkina Faso's position had inspired a joint statement from several Sahelian and West African commentators, emphasizing continental dignity and ethical diplomacy. It was no formal alliance, but the symbolism mattered. The idea of Africa as a moral actor capable of setting terms rather than merely receiving them began to take shape in public consciousness. At the same time, global observers noted a paradox. While Western nations often praised African youth for their energy and innovation, their policies frequently treated African land as expendable, useful for extraction, containment, or experimentation. The contradiction was no longer tolerable to a generation that had grown up digitally connected, politically aware and impatient with double standards. Thus, when Traore's government declared that Africa is not a landfill for failed policies or displaced people, it was not merely rejecting a specific deal. It was exposing a pattern, the tendency to export problems rather than confront them. For Africa's youth, the message was electrifying, that dignity is the highest currency of independence. Part 1 of this narration closes at a turning point in perception. What began as a small diplomatic footnote had evolved into a continental statement. The rejection did not alter global migration flows, but it altered imagination, the belief that Africa could decide its role in the world's moral economy, and that historians may one day say was where the quiet revolution truly began. The immediate aftermath of Burkina Faso's decision unfolded quietly on the world stage. There were no public sanctions, no dramatic headlines. Instead, there was something subtler, a recalibration of tone and diplomatic corridors. A once-assumed pliancy from African governments began to appear uncertain. Reports from foreign embassies across the Sahel indicated a change in atmosphere, a new caution in negotiations, a sharper awareness of national dignity. In the weeks following Traore's statement, commentators across African media began revisiting the continent's long, painful relationship with humanitarian dependency. The term human dumping entered mainstream discourse, used not as an insult but as a warning, a reminder of how moral language can be weaponized to disguise inequality. For decades, the West had perfected the vocabulary of benevolence, development cooperation, capacity building, strategic assistance. But beneath these words often lay asymmetrical power, agreements that served one side more than the other. Traore's refusal, simple and concise, disrupted that familiar choreography. It forced a new question into the global conversation. What if Africa's moral worth was not measured by its willingness to absorb others' mistakes, but by its insistence on fair exchange. Across the continent, editorial writers and political analysts began to explore that idea. In Nigeria, one columnist described Burkina Faso's act as small in geography, vast in symbolism. In Kenya, talk shows debated whether the era of blind acceptance of foreign policy experiments had ended. Even in North African media, where attention often tilted toward Mediterranean issues, commentators acknowledged that Africa's image was shifting from passive to assertive. Diplomatically, the reaction from Western capitals was muted but deliberate. Statements emphasized respect for Burkina Faso's sovereignty, while quietly hinting that humanitarian collaboration must remain open to dialogue. Yet behind the scenes, regional analysts noted subtle pressure campaigns, suspension of small aid projects, delays in arms shipments, and sudden bureaucratic reviews of trade arrangements. These were not punishments per se, they were reminders of hierarchy. But the Sahel had changed. The newly emerging alliances among Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, bound by shared security struggles and a narrative of self-determination, gave these nations new collective confidence. Individually, they were fragile. Together, they were beginning to speak with a single, defiant tone. It was no longer the voice of isolation. It was the voice of reclamation. That reclamation had deeper roots than many outsiders realized. For centuries, Africa had been cast in narratives not of its own making, first as the frontier of exploration, then as a supplier of resources, later as a recipient of aid. Even in the 21st century, this framing persisted, only dressed in the polite language of global governance. The continent was told how to grow, what to reform, who to elect, and what to sign. But the psychological weight of dependency, that invisible assumption that Africa required guidance, remained intact. By standing before the cameras and declaring that no foreign detainees would ever be accepted on African soil as part of another nation's political convenience, Traore symbolically tore a page from that old script. His critics called it political theater. His supporters called it sovereignty in action. Both were right in different ways. Symbolism has always been the true currency of independence. Nations live by the stories they tell about themselves, and for Africa, the story was changing. International think tanks began to release cautious analyses. Some warned that Africa's growing defiance might strain relationships with Western donors. Others argued that a more assertive Africa was not a threat but a necessity. A continent that respects itself is a more reliable partner. A few more cynical voices saw opportunity, new alliances, new negotiations, new chances to rebrand influence. But what no one could deny was that the psychological contract between Africa and the West was under review. The phrase dumping ground became a moral boundary. No longer limited to migration, it began to symbolize every form of external exploitation, toxic waste dumping, unfair trade terms, extractive mining, and the exploitation of Africa's digital labor force. In university discussions and social media spaces, young Africans began using the phrase to question everything from data privacy to environmental justice. Are we once again the world's testing ground? One Ugandan journalist asked on live television. Or are we finally learning to say no? The cultural shift was subtle but profound. In the past, African governments had often resisted unfair deals quietly, negotiating behind closed doors. Traore's approach was the opposite, public, declarative, unapologetic. He was not merely rejecting a policy, he was redefining the moral posture of leadership. In doing so, he tapped into a generational hunger, a need to see power used not for compliance, but for conviction. The international media initially framed the episode as another flashpoint in Africa's anti-Western turn. But African commentators quickly pushed back. "This is not anti-West," wrote one South African columnist. "It is anti-submission." The distinction mattered. What was emerging across the continent was not a desire to isolate Africa, but to negotiate from equality, a long overdue correction in the global conversation. weeks turned into months. The supposed migration partnership was quietly shelved, never officially acknowledged as canceled, but no longer pursued. Yet its ghost lingered, forcing governments across Africa to clarify their positions. Some chose silence. Others followed Burkina Faso's lead, declaring their territory off-limits for any such arrangement. For many Africans, that collective refusal was a rare moment of continental unity, not imposed from the African Union's boardrooms, but born organically from moral instinct. Meanwhile, in the global north, new discussions emerged. Could Africa's refusal mark the beginning of a broader shift, one where developing nations dictate the ethical terms of engagement? Or would the old order reassert itself through subtler economic levers? No one could predict. But what was certain was that the tone had changed. Africa was no longer merely asking to be treated fairly. It was demonstrating what fairness looked like. As this new self-awareness spread, analysts noticed a parallel in Africa's historical memory. The rejection of externally imposed solutions echoed earlier independence struggles, from Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism to Sankara's rejection of debt dependency. History, it seemed, had come full circle. The same questions that haunted Africa in the 1960s had returned in digital form. Who defines our future? Who owns our labor? Who speaks for our dignity? But now, the generation asking these questions had smartphones, platforms, and global visibility. Africa's narrative was no longer filtered through foreign correspondents or academic intermediaries. It was being written by Africans in real time, on digital screens, in multiple languages. The refusal of the human dumping deal thus became both political and symbolic, a rejection of narrative colonization as much as of policy subjugation. For Traore's administration, the domestic impact was immediate. The speech amplified national morale at a time of hardship. Across Burkina Faso's towns and villages, citizens interpreted the move as a gesture of honor, proof that even a small nation could hold its head high. That moral uplift, though intangible, mattered in a region fatigued by war and poverty. It was a reminder that sovereignty was not only about borders, but about dignity. Internationally, Africa's defiance began to reshape perceptions of global responsibility. Human rights organizations, initially cautious, began to echo parts of Burkina Faso's argument that relocation of migrants to poorer countries was not a humanitarian solution, but a moral outsourcing of responsibility. Editorials in European newspapers began to question whether the West's humanitarian conscience was truly ethical if it required exporting its burdens to others. In that paradox, Africa had found its leverage. The evolution of global opinion did not happen overnight. Yet over time, a quiet respect emerged. Burkina Faso's stance was no longer dismissed as populist. It was discussed as precedent. The principle that no nation should accept the human consequences of another's failed policies began to gain traction in policy circles. Even some Western commentators admitted that the rejection had forced a long overdue reckoning with the ethics of migration management. As the documentary tone deepens, we return to the moral center of the story, the question of what leadership means. For decades, Africa's political elite had been trained to equate leadership with alignment with global powers, with donor expectations, with inherited systems. But a new definition was emerging, shaped by those willing to risk unpopularity for principle. Leadership in this new context meant the courage to say no, not as defiance for its own sake, but as protection of dignity. By the following year, Burkina Faso's example had inspired diplomatic recalibration across the continent. Countries began reviewing aid terms more critically. Civil society groups demanded transparency in international agreements. Even regional organizations started to emphasize self-reliance and ethical partnership in their communiques. The transformation was not revolutionary, but evolutionary, a slow, steady recentering of Africa's moral compass. And yet, the world's balance of power rarely changes without resistance. As Africa's moral assertiveness grew, so too did attempts to discredit it. Commentaries resurfaced, questioning the continent's governance, its debt, its stability. familiar narratives of incompetence designed to undermine its credibility. But the audience had changed. Africans, more literate and connected than ever, recognized the script. They knew that narratives of incapacity were often tools of control. In that recognition lay Africa's quiet power. By refusing to be a dumping ground, and whether for migrants, waste, or moral responsibility, the continent had begun to reclaim something deeper than territory. It had reclaimed authorship of its own destiny. As the documentary closes, the narrator's tone softens. The world's gaze on Africa is shifting, not because Africa has suddenly become perfect, but because it has rediscovered its voice. The episode of Burkina Faso's refusal will not appear in most textbooks. History rarely honors acts of restraint. But in the moral history of the 21st century, it will stand as a marker, the moment a continent remembered that sovereignty is not given by treaties or aid, but affirmed through conscience. The closing scene returns to the image of the Sahel's horizon, vast, golden, unending. Over that landscape, the narration ends with quiet conviction. There are many ways to build a nation. Some build with wealth, others with words. But the strongest nations are built with the courage to say no, not to the world itself, but to the injustice it sometimes demands. When Africa refused to be a dumping ground, it did more than reject a plan. It reminded the world that dignity is not negotiable, and that perhaps is how freedom begins again.